Yeah, there are a lot of legal kind of interventions in this area that kind of allow the system we have and this disconnect to continue. But the ones I want to focus on is this idea of enforcement discretion. And so I'm going to talk about two separate things. First, the Justice Department under President Obama started this kind of statement of policy of what the federal government would do around cannabis legalization at the state level. They released a kind of an enforcement memo saying, we're deprioritizing going after medical cannabis systems and the people who are in compliance with them. And shortly thereafter they released another kind of enforcement memo saying, here are the things we're looking for that would drive our actual enforcement measures. Things like cannabis crossing state lines, cannabis systems that have a link to organized crime or problems with youth access or, diversion to youth outside of, kind of pediatric patients. And so there was this enforcement policy, but enforcement policy can change from administration to administration. And we saw, some rumblings around this under President Trump. But the real thing that is kind of allowing states to do what they're doing is that Congress, for a long period of time now, restricts the money that goes to the Justice Department at the federal level and says you can't use any of the funds we give you in enforcement actions against medical cannabis systems, the state's medical cannabis system, and essentially people who are in compliance with those laws. So it's this appropriations restriction that's renewed every year that prevents federal law enforcement from going after the medical cannabis systems that states are setting up. But, those restrictions don't explicitly apply to adult use systems. But I think the adult use systems are kind of protected by the spirit of that appropriations rider. And really, if you look at the degree of change that we have, I don't think the federal government is going to change course now that we have 22 jurisdictions that have legalized adult use. So that's kind of the main thing that's allowing these two kind of oppositional systems to function. I think what the interesting thing is, licensing and who receives those licenses is a huge issue. And it is really one of the key issues that states discuss in the decision to legalize. And I'm going to throw out some terms that I'll define now. This idea of social equity applicants is something that I'm going to discuss. And it goes to a problem that's a national problem, that the people who benefit from the cannabis boom and the money that's being made overwhelmingly look like me. When you look at who has ownership interests in cannabis businesses, it's disturbing. Recent studies said that they estimate that 2% of cannabis business licenses are held by Black Americans. Now, compare that to number one, kind of the demographics of the country, where Black Americans make up between 13 and 14% of the population. And you see the problem right off the bat, but we know that the war on drugs was a racist war on drugs and disproportionately impacted people of color. Even as we are transitioning our cannabis policies, Black people are still, I think it's 3.64 times as likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than their white counterparts, even though drug use is comparable across racial demographics. And I could get into more of that, but so we have these two things, not in line with representation of the general population and we have the kind of moral setting of the war on drugs and how that, there's a disconnect in the business. And so Maryland, in its medical program had some issues in terms of the diversity of folks who were receiving licenses. And there was a first round that was very problematic, and a second round where they increased the diversity in license holders, but those license holders have yet to be able to make their businesses operational. So Maryland has been very purpose-driven in this process to make sure that we have greater equity in our cannabis industry. And we're looking to provide, the legislation is looking to provide all of the first round of licenses to individuals who qualify as social equity applicants. And this looks at folks who have lived in disproportionately impacted communities, or have gone to school in them for a set period of time, or who attend higher education in the state for at least 2 years at an institution where 40% of the students qualify for Pell Grants. So it's great in that there is a specific goal, because a lot of states don't set specific goals in terms of getting licenses out. We also have, it's great that there's some other great things in the bill, like we have a social equity office that is going to take a leadership role. And, in the research that my team has done, we've created a social equity toolkit that looks at all the policy levers that states use to try to make a more inclusive industry, and having a specific body or individual designated as that equity lead is an important measure. And Maryland has incorporated a lot of tools, I think, this time around to be much more successful in diversifying the cannabis industry here. I think there are a couple things that are important to understand. And they're actually, I think, Maryland took some smart approaches. So the first thing that you alluded to was the expungement of criminal records. And cannabis possession offenses are eligible for automatic expungement under the legalization process, because we have to look back at last year's legislation that really deals with the expungement. But this means the burden is on the state to expunge that record, which means records will get expunged. Some states don't use an automatic expungement process that puts the burden on the state. They require individuals to petition. And studies show that when individuals are required to petition, you get, it's just a few percentage of folks who are actually eligible take advantage of it, because it is a process. It takes a dedication of time, knowledge, resources to get this done. So our automatic expungement is a good thing. Now, expungement seals your record, and you don't have to report that you have a criminal offense moving forward. Once that is sealed, it'll be sealed from the view, of employers. It will be, protected information. Now, that goes to kind of moving forward, but you've pointed out a lot of damage has already been done. And one of the key pieces of this legislation is how it's spending the tax revenue that it's bringing in. And between 30 and 35% of the tax revenue that's brought in, depending on whether it's the House version or the Senate version of the bill, will go to what's referred to as the Community Reinvestment and Repair Fund. And that's really focused on helping the communities that were most harmed, and minority communities, specifically, deal with these negative impacts, so that it's providing funding. Now, the language is very general in the bill about, how it's to be spent. which I think is a good thing because it will give, you know, the opportunity to kind of really kind of customize the funds to the needs of the communities. But one of the key things that I think has to happen is that there has to be a strong dialogue between the state and the impacted communities on how those funds can best be invested to help folks in terms of, you know, job training, business development. You know, a lot of key things can be done with those reinvestment funds. And that really is an important part of this in terms of kind of the restorative justice.